In 1838, a British merchant in Canton writes a letter to his wife in London. He describes his work. He sells a commodity. He has done very well. Business is booming. The local market has proven receptive. He expects to return home within the year. Comfortable. Successful. He does not mention what the commodity is. He does not mention that the men buying it from him are doing so because they cannot stop. He does not mention the addicts dying in the streets outside his warehouse. He does not mention the Chinese government official who came to him last month and asked, politely, then firmly, then desperately, that he please stop selling this thing. He does not mention that he told the official no. He does not mention that the official's government will, within 1 year, attempt to destroy his stock, arrest his colleagues, and expel every British merchant from the China coast. He does not mention that this decision, the official's decision to fight back, will be used as justification for a war. A war that Britain will win. A war that will force China to reopen its ports. A war that will force China to legalize the very commodity that was killing its people. A war that will give Britain not control of Chinese territory, but something far more valuable. Control of Chinese trade. The merchant finishes his letter. He seals it. He sets it aside. He goes to bed. Outside his window, in the harbor, the first British warships are 6 months away. But they are coming. His name was William Jardine. His commodity was opium. And what he built, the system, the trade network, the argument that selling opium into China was a matter of free trade and British rights, that system became the template for how powerful nations destroy weaker ones. Not with armies. Not primarily. But with trade. With debt. With the slow, patient construction of dependency. With the weaponization of commerce itself. This is not a story about drugs. Drugs are the instrument. This is a story about the architecture of economic warfare. About how a nation, the most financially sophisticated nation in history, decided that the fastest way to break open a closed market was to make its population physically incapable of refusing. This is a story about what happens when you combine the Bank of England with the poppy fields of Bengal. About what happens when financial genius meets moral indifference. About what happens when you realize that the most powerful weapon in the world is not a cannon. It is a contract. And if the other party won't sign the contract, you make them. Chapter 1. The Problem with China. In the year 1700, China produces approximately 35% of the entire world's economic output. Let that number sit for a moment. 35%. The entire continent of Europe, combined, produces roughly 23%. China is not a developing civilization. China is not a country that needs to be taught how to run an economy. China is the economy. The largest, most sophisticated, most productive economic system on Earth. And China has a policy. The policy is called the Canton system. It works like this: foreign merchants, British, Dutch, Portuguese, whatever, are permitted to trade with China. But only at one port. Only Canton. Only through licensed Chinese merchants called the Kohong. only for specific goods, only under specific conditions, only on terms that China sets. China does not need the world's goods. China produces everything it needs. The only thing China wants from the outside world is silver, hard currency, because silver is universal. Silver does not decay. Silver is China's preferred store of value. So the Canton system says, you want Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, you pay in silver. Those are the terms. Take them or leave them. Britain, in the early 1800s, has a problem. Britain loves tea. British civilization, by the early 1800s, runs on tea. The working class drinks tea. The middle class drinks tea. The aristocracy drinks tea. The Navy demands tea. Tea is not a luxury. Tea is a necessity of British social organization. And all of that tea comes from China, which means Britain is sending enormous quantities of silver to China every year. Year after year. Decade after decade. Silver flowing east. Tea flowing west. For Britain, this is a crisis. Not a humanitarian crisis. A financial crisis. Every ounce of silver leaving Britain is money leaving the British financial system. Money that could be invested in industry. Money that could fund the Bank of England. Money that could be used to wage wars or build ships or expand the empire. Instead, it is flowing into Chinese imperial treasuries. And China has no interest in spending it back on British goods. Because China does not need British goods. China has everything. The British East India Company, the corporate empire we described in episode 1, spends decades looking for a solution to this problem. The problem, stated simply, is how do you sell something to someone who does not want to buy anything? Various solutions are attempted. British merchants try to interest Chinese buyers in British manufactured goods. Clocks, machines, textiles. The Chinese are politely uninterested. In 1793, King George III sends an ambassador, Lord Macartney, to the Chinese emperor with a full display of British manufactured goods. The finest products of the Industrial Revolution. Evidence of Britain's technological sophistication. The emperor examines them. He is not impressed. He sends a letter back to King George III that contains one of the most diplomatically devastating sentences in history. We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. Everything Britain tries to sell, China doesn't want. Except one thing. One thing China doesn't produce domestically, that Britain can produce cheaply and in enormous quantities from its colonial holdings in India. One thing that, once people start using it, they cannot stop. One thing that, once established as a trade good, creates its own permanent demand. The East India Company has been producing opium in Bengal for decades. For medicinal use. For limited export to Southeast Asia. And someone in the company, we do not know exactly who, because the decision was never formally recorded, makes a calculation. The calculation is this. If we can get Chinese consumers addicted to opium, we have solved the trade deficit. Because addicts will pay anything. Addicts will sell anything. Addicts will trade silver for opium regardless of what their government says. The demand is not optional. The demand is physiological. We cannot create a market for British clocks in China. But we can create a market for opium. And unlike clocks, this market will self-perpetuate. Every customer we create is a customer for life. This calculation, never written down, never formally approved, just gradually implemented, becomes the foundation of British trade policy toward China for the next 40 years. Opium flows from Bengal to Canton. Silver flows from Canton to London. The trade deficit disappears. The company's profits soar. And China begins to die. Chapter 2: The Mechanism of Destruction. Here is how the system works. The East India Company controls the production of opium in Bengal, a region of northeastern India under company governance. The company licenses opium cultivation. It buys the raw product. It processes it into standardized chest quantities. It auctions those chests to private merchants in Calcutta. The private merchants, men like William Jardine, like James Matheson, then transport the chests to the China coast. They sell them to Chinese middlemen, who distribute to retailers, who distribute to users. The company itself never technically sells opium in China. This is important. This technical distance gives the company and the British government plausible deniability. We do not sell opium in China. We sell opium at auction in Calcutta. What merchants do with it after that is their affair. This is true, technically. It is a lie, structurally. The company knows exactly where the opium goes. The company profits from it. The company's entire financial model in India depends on it. By 1830, the company is exporting approximately 20,000 chests of opium to China per year. One chest contains approximately 65 kilograms of opium. 20,000 chests. 1.3 million kilograms of opium per year. Enough to supply millions of users. Enough to reverse the trade deficit entirely. Enough to start draining Chinese silver eastward, back toward India and Britain. And here is the thing that historians miss. The profits from opium sales are not merely commercial profits. They fund the British administration of India. The British East India Company, by the 1830s, is running a government. It administers territory. It pays soldiers. It builds infrastructure. It has a bureaucracy. All of that costs money. And a significant portion of that money comes from the opium trade. Which means the British colonial government of India is financially dependent on selling opium to China. If the opium trade stops, the British administration of India faces a fiscal crisis. Which means protecting the opium trade is not just commercial policy. It is imperial policy. It is strategic necessity. The Chinese government understands what is happening. By the 1830s, the social devastation is visible. Opium dens in the coastal cities. Government officials addicted. The military, soldiers whose job is to defend the nation, compromised by addiction. The silver outflow is becoming acute. Chinese economic strength is visibly declining. The emperor's advisors debate what to do. Some argue for legalization and taxation, at least control the trade and capture some revenue. Others argue for total prohibition and enforcement. The emperor chooses prohibition. He appoints a man named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner for Canton. Lin Zexu is not a corrupt official. He is not a fool. He is one of the most capable administrators the Qing Dynasty produces. And he understands exactly what he is dealing with. Lin Zexu writes a letter to Queen Victoria. This letter is one of the most remarkable documents in diplomatic history. And almost no one has read it. In it, he makes an argument that is completely logical and completely devastating. He says, "You allow your own people to produce opium, but you prohibit your own subjects in Britain from consuming it. Why? Because you know it destroys people. You know it is harmful. You know it kills. And yet you sell it to us. You would not allow it in your own country. You will not allow your own children to use it. But you are happy to let our children die from it. How do you justify this?" The letter is never formally answered. Because there is no answer that does not amount to, "We are doing this for money." And no government can formally state that. So instead, what happens is this. Lin Zexu, acting on the emperor's orders, surrounds the foreign merchants' warehouses in Canton. He gives them an ultimatum: surrender all opium stocks. Every chest. Every kilogram. Surrender it all. The merchants, outnumbered and in Chinese territory, have no choice. They surrender 20,000 chests. Lin Zexu has them destroyed. All of it. Over several weeks, the opium is dissolved in trenches mixed with salt and lime and flushed into the sea. The street value of what is destroyed is approximately £2 million British pounds. In modern terms, roughly $300 million. Gone. Into the ocean. William Jardine is in London when he hears the news. He does not panic. He goes to Parliament. He meets with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston. He makes an argument. The argument is not, "They destroyed our drugs." The argument is, "They violated British property rights. They interfered with free trade. They acted against the principles of the international commercial order." The language is completely transformed. What was a drug seizure by a sovereign government operating within its own territory becomes, in Jardine's framing, an act of aggression against British commerce. A violation of international law. Something that demands military response. Lord Palmerston, one of the most capable and most ruthless foreign policy minds in British history, listens. He agrees. He orders the Royal Navy to China. The First Opium War begins. Chapter 3: The War That Was Not About Drugs. The First Opium War lasts from 1839 to 1842. It is not a war. It is a demonstration. The British Royal Navy, by 1839, is the most advanced military force in human history. Steam-powered warships. long-range naval artillery, logistics systems capable of projecting force across the globe. The Chinese military is organized around assumptions that made sense in 1500. Large land armies, traditional weapons, coastal defenses designed against other traditional Asian military powers. The technological gap is absolute. British warships sail up the Yangtze River, one of China's most important economic arteries, and shell coastal fortifications at will. Chinese cannon cannot reach them. Chinese naval vessels cannot match their speed or firepower. The battles are, from a military perspective, not competitive. By 1842, China has no choice. It signs the Treaty of Nanjing. Now, here is what the Treaty of Nanjing actually says. And this is where the story becomes something very different from a war about drugs. The Treaty of Nanjing requires China to 1. Pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to Britain. This indemnity includes, explicitly, in the text of the treaty, $6 million specifically to compensate British merchants for the opium that Lin Zexu destroyed. Read that again slowly. China is required to compensate the drug dealers for the drugs its government seized and destroyed. 2. Cede Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. A sovereign piece of Chinese territory, handed to Britain, permanently. 3. Open 5 ports to British trade: Canton, Shanghai, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Amoy. These ports must allow British merchants to live and trade freely, under conditions that China cannot restrict. 4. Most significantly, grant Britain most favored nation status. This means that any concession China grants to any other nation in the future must automatically be granted to Britain as well. Let's understand what most favored nation status means in practice. It means that China can never have a trade relationship with anyone else that does not also apply to Britain. It means that Britain is embedded, structurally and permanently, into every future trade agreement China makes. It means that China cannot negotiate its way out of British commercial dominance, because any improvement in China's situation automatically benefits Britain. The system has been locked in. Not by military occupation, Britain does not occupy China. But by treaty, by contract, by the legal framework of international commerce that Britain controls and enforces. And the opium? The Treaty of Nanjing does not explicitly legalize opium. That comes later, in the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860, in the Treaty of Tientsin. By 1860, opium is not merely tolerated in China. It is legally protected. Chinese law, modified under treaty pressure, cannot prohibit it, cannot restrict it, cannot tax it in ways that make it commercially unviable. The addiction is now legal. The market is now permanent. The silver outflow is now structurally embedded. Here is the number that matters. In 1800, China's share of global GDP is approximately 33%. In 1950, after a century of the system established by the Opium Wars treaties, China's share of global GDP is approximately 4%. 33 to 4. That is what a century of treaty-enforced trade subordination does to the largest economy in human history. not military conquest, not territorial occupation. A trade war, fought with drugs, enforced by contracts, maintained by the threat of naval force. This is financial colonialism in its most complete form. Chapter 4: The argument that made it legal. Lord Palmerston never called this a war about drugs. He was too smart for that. He called it a war about free trade. And this is where the intellectual architecture of the Opium Wars becomes something that deserves careful attention. Because the free trade argument is not simply cynical propaganda. It is a coherent position. It has internal logic. The argument goes like this. Britain believes in free trade. The free flow of goods between nations is good for everyone. Trade creates wealth. Trade creates peace. The more nations trade, the more interdependent they become, and the more expensive war becomes. China's Canton system is protectionism. China restricts trade. China limits which goods can be traded, at which ports, under which conditions, at prices China sets unilaterally. This is not free trade. This is economic nationalism. This is China using its power to set trading terms that benefit China at the expense of its trading partners. Britain, the champion of free trade, cannot allow this. Britain must force China to open its markets. For the good of global commerce. For the principles of free exchange. For the future of international trade. If you have watched our Britain episode, you already know how to read this argument. Britain did not invent free trade because Britain believed in mutual benefit. Britain invented free trade because Britain had overwhelming competitive advantage. Free trade, when one party has overwhelming advantage, does not create mutual benefit. Free trade, when one party has overwhelming advantage, creates permanent dominance for the stronger party and permanent dependency for the weaker party. We described this mechanism in Episode 1. The Opium Wars are the moment when that mechanism is deployed against the largest economy in the world. But here is what makes the Opium Wars argument uniquely perverse. Britain is not merely arguing for free trade. Britain is arguing for the right to sell a product that Britain itself prohibits at home. Opium is not freely traded in Britain. The British government regulates it strictly. British physicians can prescribe certain opium-based preparations. But free commercial sale of opium for recreational use is not permitted in Britain. So Britain's argument is, you must allow our merchants to freely sell in your country a product that we do not allow to be freely sold in ours. Because free trade. And it works. Not because it is logically coherent. It is not logically coherent. It works because Britain has the Royal Navy. And China does not. In the 19th century, as in the 21st, the rules of international trade are made by the most powerful. And the most powerful define the rules in their own interest. And then call those rules universal principles. Lord Palmerston writes in a private letter, around this time, something that reveals the full calculation. He does not need to justify the war morally. He needs to justify it commercially. And commercially, the justification is simple: British merchants have property rights. Those property rights were violated. Britain defends the property rights of British merchants everywhere in the world. What the property was, opium, weapons, slaves, anything, is not the Foreign Secretary's concern. The principle is the property right. The principle is the free market. The principle is that British commercial interests, operating within British-defined rules of international trade, cannot be interfered with by any sovereign government anywhere in the world, regardless of what those governments consider to be in their own people's interest. This is the doctrine that governs international trade today. Not the same words, not the same actors, but the same structure. The WTO, the IMF, free trade agreements, the principle that domestic regulatory decisions cannot interfere with the rights of foreign commercial entities. All of this is descended, intellectually and structurally, from Lord Palmerston's argument in 1839. The argument that William Jardine brought to Parliament. The argument that sent the Royal Navy to China. The argument that forced China to accept terms that began a century of decline. Chapter 5: The Second War and the Final Terms. The First Opium War ends in 1842. The Second Opium War begins in 1856. Why a second war? Because China, despite the Treaty of Nanjing, continues to resist. Chinese officials continue to make life difficult for British merchants. Chinese ports continue to impose conditions. The Chinese government, despite the treaty, continues to behave as if it has sovereign rights within its own territory. The immediate trigger for the Second Opium War is an incident involving a ship called the Arrow. A Chinese vessel registered under a British flag in Hong Kong. Chinese officials board it, arrest the crew, and remove the British flag. Britain claims this is an insult to the British flag, an act of aggression against British commercial interests. Most historians agree that the Arrow incident is a pretext. Britain has been looking for a reason for a second war. The Arrow provides one. This time, France joins Britain. The combined force is overwhelming. The Second Opium War ends in 1860 with the Convention of Peking. The Convention of Peking makes the Treaty of Nanjing look restrained. The Convention of Peking requires China to 1. Legalize the opium trade completely and permanently. 2. Open 11 additional ports to foreign trade. 3. Allow foreign diplomats to reside permanently in Beijing, in the capital itself, not restricted to coastal trading ports. 4. Allow Christians to operate freely throughout China. Missionaries can go anywhere. This is not humanitarian. This is the soft power that follows hard power. 5. Cede the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, expanding the Hong Kong colony. 6. Pay an indemnity of 8 million taels of silver to Britain and 8 million taels to France. 7. Grant foreigners the right to travel freely throughout China, on their own terms, without Chinese restriction. What does this mean, taken together? It means that China, which 20 years ago was the world's largest economy, which had operated a sophisticated system of managed trade for centuries, which had successfully excluded foreign commercial penetration for decades, is now fully open. Not open in the sense of willing to trade. Open in the sense of unable to close. Open in the sense that its borders, its trade terms, its internal travel, its legal code, its currency flows, all of these are now governed not by Chinese sovereign decision-making but by the treaty framework imposed by Britain and France. China has not been colonized in the traditional sense. Britain has not appointed a governor. Britain has not hoisted a flag over Beijing. But China has been opened in a way that makes sovereignty largely theoretical. In the decades following 1860, other powers joined the treaty framework. The United States, Russia, Japan, Germany. Each negotiates most favored nation status. Each gets the same terms Britain extracted. The entire major world powers are now commercially embedded in China under terms that China did not choose and cannot change. China is governed, from inside its own borders, by foreign commercial and legal rights that supersede Chinese sovereign authority. This arrangement is given a name. The name is the Century of Humiliation. The Chinese remember it. They are remembering it right now. Chapter 6: The Century of Humiliation and the World It Made. After 1860, China spends approximately 90 years trying to understand what happened to it. This is not a simple process. China had been the world's greatest civilization. It had never seriously imagined that it could be humiliated by Europeans. The concept was nearly incomprehensible. So the first response is denial. The treaties were imposed by force. They are temporary. The empire will recover its strength. The foreigners will leave. But they don't leave, because the treaties do not require them to leave. The treaties give them permanent legal rights on Chinese soil. And so the second response is something more desperate: reform. In the 1860s and 1870s, Chinese officials attempt to modernize, to adopt Western technology, Western military organization, Western industrial methods. This effort, called the self-strengthening movement, is sincere. It produces some results. China builds arsenals, builds a navy, develops some industrial capacity. But it fails to address the fundamental structural problem. The fundamental structural problem is that China's economy is now embedded in a treaty framework that gives foreign commercial interests rights that supersede Chinese sovereign economic authority. You cannot build a competitive national industry when foreign goods can enter your market at terms you cannot control. You cannot develop competitive financial institutions when foreign banks operate in your major commercial cities under legal protections you cannot modify. You cannot maintain the silver flows that make your economy function when your trade terms are dictated by others. The third response comes after a catastrophic demonstration of continued weakness. In 1894 to 1895, China fights a war against Japan. Japan, which had been in a similar position to China in the 1850s, facing Western commercial pressure, had chosen a different response to Western power. Japan did not try to maintain its traditional structure while selectively adopting Western technology.